since you could draw breath. And of course, of Patrick Henry, give me liberty or death. You've heard of Thomas Jefferson, Ben Franklin, Adams too. They're called the Founding Fathers, and to them our thanks are due. But there were also founding mothers whose stories are less known. But they too loved their country, then they fought to save their home. Some fought with pen, with spinning wheel, with spying eyes and ears, and some picked up a musket to defend what they held dear. Deborah Sampson, Lydia Darraugh, and Mariah Lane, Kate and Sybil Ludington, just a fraction of the names of these women we must not forget, for their deeds both great and small. Stories of our founding mothers are the stories of us all. It all started for me with a trip to Carmel, New York. On the side of the road in the little town of Carmel in upstate New York, there is a statue of a young woman on a rearing horse with a stick in her hand. It was the statue of Sybil Ludington, who is sometimes known as the female Paul Revere. Sybil's father was the colonel of the local militia, and when the British began to burn down nearby Danbury, Connecticut, which was a major supply depot for the revolutionary forces, all of the militia had gone home for planting season. And so, because the colonel was needed to muster the troops at his farm, he sent out his oldest daughter to ride to each one of those hamlets, to pound on their door with a stick and yell, "The British are burning Danbury, come to Ludington Farm." 40 miles, they say, she rode through the night, and in the fashion of oral tradition, things got a little more dramatic. There was a raging thunderstorm. There was a brigand who she was almost accosted by, except she hit him with that stick, and there was a narrow escape from British patrols. Did it happen that way? We don't know. There are no contemporary accounts of Sybil's ride. But it was important enough to the people of Carmel and the Daughters of the American Revolution there in Putnam County to commission this beautiful statue. Sybil made it onto U.S. postage. And I think it demonstrates how much we want, how much we need heroes and heroines. We want to be inspired. We need to be inspired. Well, after I saw the statue, I began to get interested in the history of women in the American Revolution. It's not something that I was taught in school, for sure. For example, of course I knew about the tax on tea. Everybody grows up knowing that. In school, you hear about the Boston Tea Party. You hear about taxation without representation. how that was a big part of what led up to the revolution. But what I never knew was that there were also taxes on textiles, on glass, on paper goods, on salt. These were all things that were imported from Great Britain, and they were taxed as well. And who was it that bought these things for the household? The tea, the paper, the textiles. It wasn't the men, it was the women. They began to have boycotts. Now, they weren't called boycotts because that word hadn't been coined yet. It would be not until the 19th century. But they encouraged women to make their own tea out of raspberry leaves or other herbs, to not buy already made cloth, but to go back to spinning and weaving their own homespun. Historian Carol Birkin says that women, the minute they found out that they could buy cloth, had put those spinning wheels away, because spinning is really tedious, it's really time consuming, and women were glad to be shed of it. But when the boycotts came into effect, women got out their spinning wheels once more. They called it Liberty Homespun. And organizations sprung up like the Daughters of Liberty that would have spinning bees. And so what that meant was a bunch of women would bring their spinning wheels and park themselves on the lawn of a local revolutionary spirited minister and have these events where they would spin in public so that people could see. It was both practical and it was propaganda. Now, we have pundits or late night hosts who write sketches about the political scene, our contemporary political scene. Back in that time, such things appeared in the newspapers. And so this next song that I want to share with you is an example of that. It was rather humorously encouraging the ladies to only use cloth of their own manufacturing, as you'll hear. Young ladies in town and those who live round, wear none but your own country linen. Of economy boast, let your pride be the most, to sew clothes of your own making spinning. What if homespun, they say, be not quite as gay as brocades, be not in a passion? Why, for once it is known, 'tis much worn in town, one and all will cry out, 'tis the fashion! And as one all agree that you'll not married be to such as will wear London factory, but at first sight refuse. Tell 'em that you will choose to encourage our own manufactory. No more ribbons wear, nor in rich silks appear. Love your country much better than fine things. Be soon 'twill be fashioned to grace your smooth locks with a twine string. So not only were the ladies encouraged to wear Liberty homespun, they were also encouraged to refuse marriage proposals from men who were not patriots. And soon women too began to write things that appeared in the newspaper, which was totally scandalous to some parts of society. Women, or at least ladies' names, should never appear in the paper except in an obituary. But ladies were writing their opinions about men who were not patriots, encouraging other women to take part in the boycotts and do whatever they could to promote the revolutionary cause. There was a woman named Mercy Otis Warren who wrote plays and propaganda. She had been educated in the same way that her brother had been, which is to say, a classical education. And she wrote well, or at least was considered to have written well in the style of the time. And so her friends encouraged her to use her pen to promote the colonists' cause. And so she wrote many plays, she wrote pamphlets, all anonymously, at least until 1790. And one thing you may not know, I didn't, about Mercy Otis Warren, is that she is actually responsible for penning the Bill of Rights to our Constitution. There were men whose names had been associated with the Bill of Rights, but in some primary sources, it was discovered that actually, no, it was Mercy Otis Warren who wrote the Bill of Rights. She also wrote, after the war, one of the earliest histories of the American Revolution. Now, when war started in 1775, many women found themselves in the position, as their men went off to war, of not only doing all their own work, but if they had a farm, also doing that work as well. It was very hard. One of the leading reasons why men deserted during the Revolutionary War was not because they were cowardly, but rather because they got letters from home where their wives said, "I can't chop enough firewood. Your children will freeze. Please come home. I can't get all the crop into the ground. Please come home and help, or we will starve." And so men would go home. Now, other women, especially those who lived in towns, those whose families did not have property, actually followed the men to war. Carol Birkin, who I mentioned before, talks about that picture of Washington and the soldiers at Valley Forge, and she says it's totally inaccurate because it doesn't show any women, but women were a vital part of the war effort. They were called camp followers, which I, like maybe you, thought that meant they were prostitutes, but no. They did a lot of vital service for the army. They cooked, they nursed wounded soldiers, they did some cleaning, and they did laundry, which may not sound like a big deal, but one of the major problems for the troops was with lice. Young men went into the army with just the clothes on their backs, and they didn't change them, and after about 3 weeks, they had lice. And where there are lice, there is scratching, and where there is scratching, there are sores, and of course, there were also things that happened, like one of the games that they would play while they were waiting for the next battle would be to take hot tar and see who could throw the most tar on the most lice, which then led not only to sores, but to burns. So the women who were doing laundry were doing a good service for the army because, of course, with sores, with burns, if infections set in, that meant you had men who were not battle ready. So they were helping the soldiers, the revolutionary cause, not just with better hygiene, but with better health. There's a beautiful song that you may have heard. It's called "Johnny Has Gone for a Soldier," and I'd like to share that with you now. Here I sit on buttermilk hill. Who can blame me? Cry my fill. And every tear would turn a mill. Johnny has gone for a soldier. Johnny has gone for a soldier. Shula, 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 room. Shula, 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 room. And every tear would turn a mill. Johnny has gone for a soldier. Johnny has gone for a soldier. With fife and drum he marched away. He would not heed a word I'd say, and he'll not come back for many a day. Johnny has gone for a soldier. Johnny has gone for a soldier. I'll sell my rod, I'll sell my reel. Likewise, I'll sell my spinning wheel. And I'll buy my love a sword of steel. Johnny has gone for a soldier. Johnny has gone for a soldier. In addition to the women who followed the armies as nurses or laundresses, there were those who fought right alongside the men. In the forts, the women helped with the cannons. You may have heard the name Molly Pitcher. That wasn't an actual, or it wasn't one woman. Molly Pitcher was what the women who helped with the cannons were called. You see, after a cannon was fired, it had to be cooled. And so the cannon would fire, and one of the men up on the walls would call out, "Molly Pitcher!" And a woman would come out with a pitcher of water to pour on the cannon to help cool it down. And sometimes, as it happened, there's a very famous picture of this, a woman would take the place of the man. If he had been wounded or he had been killed, the woman would take over with firing the cannon. But there were also women, and we don't know how many, who actually dressed themselves as men and went to fight right alongside them. The most famous of these women was Deborah Sampson, and she actually masqueraded as a man and fought very bravely for 3 years. The story goes that she was wounded twice, and the second time it was in the thigh, and she was so afraid that she'd be found out that she removed the musket ball herself, which I can't even imagine doing. She was found out, though, eventually, because she got one of the notorious camp fevers and was hospitalized in Philadelphia. And of course, when the doctor went to see her and opened her shirt, yeah. Anyway, but Deborah Sampson wrote about her life as a soldier, and she toured around the country telling her story. And actually, when her husband, she did receive a military pension for her service, and after she died, her husband sued to get the pension as her widow. So she was a very interesting woman. Now, you might be thinking, well, how did they manage that? Well, as I mentioned before, people did not often change their clothes in the army of that time. They didn't often bathe, and they could go into the woods to relieve the call of nature. Plus, there was no such thing as an army physical. The only thing that you had to have to be able to fight was front teeth and a working thumb and forefinger, so that you could bite off the paper of the cartridge and reload your musket and fire it. So women were able to go undetected for some time. We have a woman like that right here in Richmond. Now, she was originally born in New Hampshire, we think. Her name was Anna Mariah Lane. She was married to a man named John Lane, and she, being a poorer woman, went to war with her husband. He joined the army of Israel Putnam in New Jersey, I believe. And as they worked their way south, Anna Mariah originally worked as a nurse and doing some of the other things that I've described: laundry, cleaning, cooking, and so forth. But when they got into Pennsylvania, George Washington issued an edict that all the women and children, which, by the way, he never liked having them following the army to begin with. But as the fighting was getting fiercer against the British, he sent all the women home. And because Anna Mariah did not want to be separated from her husband, and perhaps also because she really didn't have a home to go to anymore, she, according to the records that we have, primary sources, disguised herself as a man and fought right alongside her husband. Eventually, the Lanes made their way to Virginia, and John Lane became part of the public guard after the Revolutionary War. Anna Mariah became a nurse for the public guard, and they served in this capacity in Richmond until they were too old and too sick to continue serving. And along with some other men, they requested a military pension from the governor. The governor went before the General Assembly, and they were indeed awarded pensions. The men were awarded pensions of $40 a year, which was quite generous. But Anna Mariah Lane was awarded a pension of $100 a year, which was very good indeed. And though we don't have the details, what it says in the record is because during the Battle of Germantown, she had donned the garb of a soldier and had shown great courage in her military service. Now, what did she do? Unfortunately, they didn't describe exactly what she did, but we do know that she was wounded during that battle, and it left her lame for the rest of her life, actually. The Battle of Germantown was not a success. There was a lot of fog that day, and even though the British were outnumbered by the colonial troops, there were mix-ups, and the British were able to take refuge in a house called the Chew House, and from that vantage, the house was a big brick house. It was virtually unassailable, and there were a few colonial troops who, even despite the fact that others were retreating, tried again and again to take the house. A lot of them were bayoneted to death by the British soldiers. And so maybe that was where Anna Mariah had received her wound. Perhaps she had tried to get into the Chew House to take it. We don't know. But as I said, what we do know is that her service had impressed the General Assembly enough that they gave her this terrific pension for the rest of her life. Now, in Virginia, of course, there were slaves, enslaved people, and that was true all over, actually all over the colonies. Although in the North, slavery was outlawed. In Massachusetts first, there was a woman who took the name Elizabeth Freeman. The name she had been given as an enslaved woman was Mum Bet. And she listened and heard the people talking about the Massachusetts Constitution that had been ratified after the Revolutionary War. And she decided to sue for her freedom because she said slavery cannot continue to exist if this is true, what it says in the Massachusetts Constitution. So she contacted a lawyer who later became a leading proponent of abolition, and he was successful in getting her freedom. And as I said, she took the name Elizabeth Freeman and spent the rest of her life as a paid domestic laborer working for her lawyer, and also as a midwife. In the South, of course, things were different. And there's a story that comes out of Georgia of an enslaved woman called Kate. The family to whom she belonged was the Hurd family, and Stephen Hurd was an officer, a general in the colonial army during the Revolution. He fought very bravely. He was a good friend of George Washington. And at one point, however, during the fighting in Georgia, the British captured Hurd. And when word got back to the plantation that he owned, where Kate and her husband Jack lived, they devised a plot to go and rescue him. This appears in letters in the family. How dramatic was it? It's a little bit like that story about Sybil Ludington. Kate was said to be a very tall, strong woman. Some said she was over 6 feet tall. That's certainly possible. And then other parts of the story say that she traveled 50 miles to Augusta, where Stephen Hurd was being kept in a British jail. Some versions of the story say that she went to the British jail and she ingratiated herself to the guards doing laundry for money, which was not uncommon. And that one day she went in and she had heard that Stephen Hurd was going to be executed the next day. And the story goes that the jailers said, "Oh, don't bother with him. They're going to hang him tomorrow." And she said, "Well, don't you think it would be a Christian thing to allow a man to die in clean clothes?" I don't know. It makes a great story, but the story goes that she had a big basket of laundry, and Stephen Hurd, being a diminutive man, was able to fit in that big basket with clothes over the top of him, and that Kate was able to carry him right out of the prison to where her husband Jack was waiting with horses, and he made his escape. I should acknowledge that for most enslaved people, the American Revolution did not mean freedom. Of course not. Many of them left, ran away from where they were enslaved, and made their way to British camps. The British had put it out there that if they came, they would be awarded their freedom, and so women and men and children went, as many as could go. I wish I could tell you that the British treated them well. They did not. They were often shorted on food and undernourished. They were even more susceptible than the troops to the diseases that went through the camps. after the war was over, many loyalists were taken by ship to be resettled in Canada. During that time, the African Americans who were put on those ships to be taken to Canada with the other loyalists, some of the ship captains decided to take them to the West Indies and sell them back into slavery until one of the admirals put an end to that and told them that they would not be paid, the ship captains would not be paid if they did that. But even once, if they made it to Canada, these formerly enslaved people were not treated well. The white settlers stole their land. The supplies that were meant for them were taken. And so a number of them left Canada and resettled in Sierra Leone to have a better life. But getting back to Kate Heard, like a lot of enslaved people, she probably took the last name of the Heard family. Getting back to Kate, she is buried in the Heard family plot. And she has a headstone, as does her husband, Jack. And she is the only African-American woman ever to be recognized by the Georgia Sons of the American Revolution. There's so many more stories. I wish I had all day to tell you more of them. But I hope that this will whet your appetite for these stories, these often unheard stories about women in the American Revolution. May we never forget the gift that women and men, their sacrifices, the gift of freedom that we are privileged to enjoy. And let us never cease to endeavor to make sure that that freedom lasts and that it is for everyone freedom.